Welcome to the Beatlemaniacs, and we're back again. I think we're turning into a monthly, guys. What do you say?
Seems that way.
The Beatles have been here forever, so whenever we can get out here and talk about them, it's a good opportunity to.
I mean, we're not going to run out of stuff, I don't think.
Exactly.
I want to, and I've been wanting to do this since the first show, because on the very first show and on the second show, I think, Phil, you mentioned a guy named Magic Alex. Can you define Magic Alex and why he's significant to the Beatles?
You might be able to be a little bit more specific about it, but he was a techie guy, a engineer of sorts that came up with a lot of clever, unique instruments or recording techniques or state-of-the-art stuff that seemed cool but wasn't always practical. Almost like the guy from Gremlins, Peltzer, that's creating these things, the wand of the toothbrush of the future that sprays you in the face. It's something cool and unique and was pushing the edge of what you could do in that time period with recording or music. He created some instruments as well that you could see the Beatles playing with at different times in the Get Back video. But I think that's basically what he was. And going into the Let It Be sessions, the Beatles wanted to do something different than working with George Martin again, and I believe he was more George's friend, but they all tasked him with building the ultimate studio, which ended up being a colossal failure, and George Martin had to come in there and try to, at least this is what my remembrance of the situation. George Martin had to come in there and basically correct everything, and pretty much everything that Magic Alex put together ended up being trash for that particular session, and that added to that supposed tension during those Get Back sessions.
Guys, what do you have anything to add to that?
The famous story is that he was supposed to build a 32-track recorder, and George Harrison commented that when he saw the studio, he had these 32 different speakers in the wall, on the top of the wall. And I think that's when they ended up having to bring in George's home equipment into the Get Back sessions. I seem to recall hearing once that Magic Alex also had an affair with Cynthia Lennon. And I think that came out of Cynthia Lennon's A Twist of Lennon book, which I once had. I don't have it anymore.
Wow, I never heard that one.
Yes, yeah, I seem to, and I was trying to confirm, was it Cynthia or Maureen? No, it was Cynthia. It wasn't Maureen or Patty or Jane Asher. And I think that came from the Twist of Lennon book. Not a lot of info was provided, but I think Lennon also knew about it, and that might have been, I can't remember where Yoko was in the picture, if she was there or not. I'm guessing Yoko was already around because she was around during the White Album sessions.
I seem to remember something about when John and Yoko recorded two versions that Cynthia was in Greece with Magic Alex and some friends.
Yeah.
That's about the only thing I can add to the Magic Alex legend.
I get the impression from a lot of this stuff that Magic Alex was a fraud. I mean, he was great at electricity, but particularly I thought he was closer to John than to George, and John actually kind of proves his gullibility there, in my opinion, of course, because I wasn't there, but just from the sources that I've read, it sounds like, you know, he was taken in by Magic Alex as he was later taken in by Alan Klein. What do you guys think of that?
Len, I think you pointed out something that's worth mentioning, because we're here, you know, we're a Beatles podcast. We're the Beatlemaniacs. We're talking about how much we love the Beatles as musicians, as individuals, but within each one of them, they also had some I wouldn't call them issues, but quirks. John was very influenceable. Yeah.
Easily influenced.
John is very easily influenced. Sorry, I had a Yosemite Sam moment there for a second. I couldn't get out the word. But so whether it be on a positive note or a negative note, this has been worded by many different people at many different times. Nothing got done with John unless there was another person there, someone to sort of influence him, guide him. For years, it was that competition with Paul or having that special relationship or bond with Brian Epstein and wanting to impress him. And then eventually, to the remainder of his life, it was Yoko. He always needed to have someone steering the ship. So I think by saying he did have a sense of gullibility, or I would say it's an innocence. This innocence, this even though he was cutting and biting, he still was probably the most naive and innocent of them all, like a doe-eyed in some ways, I think, and could easily be guided around.
And it's kind of ironic because he, of all of the Beatles, had that tough veneer, which Paul always says in interviews when the subject comes up was a shield. It was just fake.
I seem to remember Harrison saying that the best I can't remember what it was, some little trinket that Magic Alex came up with, because he said most of the stuff never worked. And I can't remember, he referenced it in interviews. Anybody recall what those little trinkets
Yeah,
were that he said?
I remember too, but I don't remember.
I remember it as well. He mentions it. Oh, that thing's pretty cool. Like he's talked about it in a couple of different interviews, and I want to say it was a trinket, an instrument of some sort, like an electric or a digital.
Or a toilet? Was it a toilet or something?
It was something weird.
A toilet that I remember it from the anthology series. I guess we have some homework to do.
It's been a very long time. I was watching some clips because of one of the topics I'm going to be discussing later. I was watching some clips from the anthology and I just thought to myself how long it's been since I watched that in its entirety. I've listened to the records of the anthology records more than I've rewatched the entire video presentation. And it's a really excellent documentary. And I like how they put John's words in there too. They place John's words in interesting time points, especially if you've seen the Imagine documentary, where you can see where they grabbed a lot of it from. They select certain quotes and they frame John in a very positive way in the anthology. But I think he's harder on himself in Imagine than the Beatles are on him in the anthology.
Did anybody see, or I imagine everybody saw, Julian Lennon performing Imagine on the benefit of for Ukraine?
I've
So
heard
did you-
about it. I haven't seen it yet.
I heard it. I didn't actually see it. I heard the recording.
Same here. I heard it. I didn't see it.
I saw it. I heard about it, and it was a really nice performance and very significant in light of the fact that Julian always says he will never perform his father's music. And in this case, he made an exception. So it kind of brings a lot of importance to it, I think.
And I think both John's sons in a different way really do honor his memory in a way that not all musicians, not all people that have parents that are musicians, some of them take advantage of it. They use their name to create the ex Bonham band. Oh, sorry. Like the Jason Bonham band or something. I'm not punishing Jason Bonham here, but I'm saying like some people live off of that last name or something. I think Julian and Sean have had opportunities open up for them, but they've both done a really excellent job of differentiating themselves from their father and not, like you said, not wanting to necessarily perform the music unless it's a special occasion and really honoring him as a special force. I mentioned this, I think, in the first podcast we did. There's a wonderful interview with Sean Lennon and Paul McCartney, which is the best interview I've ever heard with Paul McCartney. And just you can hear the joy and love that he has and the protection that he takes for that. Again, unlike maybe some of the Marleys for Bob or Jason Bonham does necessarily for the remnants of their father trying to use that as a selling point for themselves instead of use it as an opportunity to honor the legacy. And I think
One thing I've noticed lately over the last couple of years, and I wonder if you all have noticed the same, there's been a lot more, anytime there's a gathering with Ringo or Paul or something for George or John, anything going on, you always see several of the Beatles' children there together. And I did read that Danny Harrison's best friend is Stella McCartney. I think Danny said that, but it's nice. I saw recent pictures with Danny, with Sean and Julian at some event. And I saw one of the McCartney daughters, it wasn't Stella, it was the other one, Mary, it was one of the Lennon boys, I forget which one. It's nice to see that. I guess Ringo's son just got married too, and there was one of the other kids were there as well. It's nice to see that their children are friends as well. That's what I'm getting at.
I agree. And it we talked about this before too. It's more dispels the rumors that, post Let It Be, it was all agitation. These people had to have grown up with each other and grown those affinities over time, that they truly exist. And it feels real. I agree with that, Seth, 100%. It's really wonderful to see. And it just makes you feel like that family feeling that I think you feel through all the Beatles music, again, that you don't always feel with bands that are just as good, write amazing songs. There is a sense of camaraderie, of brotherhood within the four of those guys. And again, that kind of goes into a topic I'm going to be talking about a little bit later, in the sense that they had each other to lean on, where maybe some other artists didn't.
It's really interesting because more than other celebrity children, the children of the Beatles have a real shared kind of a burden that they can only share with each other. And I think that's probably what makes their bond very unique, even as close as cousins or even siblings, because, you know, the burden of being the son of John, Paul, and George, you know, or the daughter, no one else could possibly relate as much as they could to each other.
Yeah, they
Especially-
I
really
don't
all
think-
done a good job of, you know, not exploiting, you know,
Mhm.
their fathers. And I was just thinking about the, is it Zach Starkey that plays for the Who?
Yes.
Yes.
You guys hear the
Mhm.
story? It might have been Alice Cooper talking about Uncle Keith teaching Zach how to play the drums, or
Oh.
like saying to Ringo, who's going to teach him to play drums? He's like, Uncle Keith. And, you know, it's just really ironic that, you know, he's the drummer for the Who.
Mhm.
That's
And
pretty
Len,
cool.
and Len, to your point about, it's not, even especially with Julian and Sean that play music, every musician, every rock musician or pop musician in some ways that come after the Beatles have to deal with those big shadows on the wall behind them of some of the two of the greatest songwriters of well, ever. And to be songwriters as well, to be musicians as well, and also not just have the pressure of that of your parents on you, having that pressure of being John Lennon as your father, one of the greatest single songwriters of all time. And I think that they've done, I don't want to just pile on joy onto them, because everyone has moments of ups and downs, but I think both of them have done such an exceptional job. I can't celebrate them enough. And I know we jumped from Magic Alex to Julian and Sean, but it is worth mentioning about the two of them, that I think they've done such an excellent job representing the Beatles and their father.
Going back to Magic Alex, after the Get Back sessions, I don't recall hearing much about whatever happened to Magic Alex.
No.
He
Well, I
magically
assumed it was
disappeared.
because they rejected him after he let them down too many times.
It is interesting. I wonder what happened to all that equipment, if they just delivered all his equipment and then take all your
Drop
stuff,
it
you
on
know.
the steps.
Yeah, just throw it on his steps like they're getting a divorce. Just throw it out of the car. There's your equipment. 16 speakers. Hear it in my.
Wow. I found a track from Double Fantasy on YouTube the other day of I'm Losing You with the backing musicians Cheap Trick. Has
wow.
anyone ever heard that?
Yes,
I haven't
I
heard of
did
that
several.
recording.
You
Uh,
have.
Yes, I like them actually. I like the harder edge to them.
Mhm.
And evidently he recorded with Cheap Trick. And Yoko, if I'm remembering the story correctly, was the one that rejected those recordings.
Wow.
Yes, I wasn't aware of that up until about a year and a half ago.
I didn't know any of that.
I didn't know any of that before I found it. It was a very, very good track, you know, very stripped down and raw
Mhm.
and alive, you know. Have you heard it, Dave?
I have, and I don't know if I'm confusing the two. Is this the one where John's playing that handmade wooden square guitar? There's a name for it, but
Not that I know
actually
of. I
live
don't
in the
know. It could be.
studio playing. I think I'm confusing the two, but I have seen that video. But I didn't realize that they had played together.
There was no video of Cheap
Right.
Trick and John. It wasn't a live record. It was like just an audio
Yeah.
recording
Right.
that I heard.
And they had recorded most of the John songs from Double Fantasy for John, or they'd performed a couple times with him in it. 'Cause I guess if Yoko refused it, I wonder because Double Fantasy, and I don't know if it's the same for all of the John and Yoko albums. It's the one album I know has more Yoko songs than John songs on it.
That's
So I don't
Double
know.
Fantasy.
I don't know if she had more creative control over how it was going to be depicted and stuff. But I would have liked to see John with a band with like an '80s rock metal band like that, rocking out some of those songs. You could on Double Fantasy, you can hear it. I mean, I think some of them are good in the versions that they have. One of my favorite John songs of all time is on that album with Watching the Wheels. Occasionally the Beatles write songs where you're like, this would have been an amazing Beatles song. And I think John has several of those songs, and Paul has a few as well. Baby I'm Amazed is the one that points out to me. I'm like, oh, this should have been a Beatles song. I could hear John's voice with Paul right there. But Double Fantasy with Cheap Trick, that would have been very interesting. Very, very interesting.
It had a less poppy sound to it. There was one other track they did that was also redone, and I can't recall what it is right now. I wasn't watching the rules or starting over, and it wasn't Beautiful Boy. I'm trying. There was, if you can bring up one of the other songs, my mind's gone blank.
Cleanup Time.
It might have been Cleanup Time.
Yeah, that would make sense. That would actually make sense.
But I couldn't find any more tracks. I looked for more. I knew they must have done more than one song with John, but the only thing that's on YouTube is I'm Losing You.
I think I have them on my phone. I think it was one of the
okay.
things I was able to download from a company that has the same name as theirs.
So the last newsy kind of a thing is Ringo is going to be performing with the All-Star Band at the Sound on Sound Festival on September 23rd at the Harvard Healthcare Amphitheater. And with him will be in the All-Star Band is Hamish Stewart, Toto's Steve Lukather, and I wrote this so sloppy, Warren Ham, Oleg Gish, I can't pronounce it, and Edgar Winter.
Oh, Edgar Winter.
Yeah. And the guests are going to be Stevie Nicks and Dave Matthews and Tim Reynolds, the Lumineers, Brandy Carlisle, and The National. Do you know who The National is?
Tim Reynolds is the guitar player for Dave Matthews as well. So that's who he is. Everyone but Dave Matthews there, I'm really excited for. That'd be great. Sorry, I'm not a big Dave Matthews fan.
I'm not either.
The musicianship in the band is very good. I'm just not a fan of him as a singer. His voice kind of puts me off. But the drummer is one of the best drummers working. But that sounds like an excellent show. How much does people that have actually seen Ringo in recent times? How much drums does he play in a live show? Is it for a couple of songs here and there, or?
Yeah, the last time I saw him was 2012 or 13, and he plays a few songs, but it's never him, solo. There's always another drummer.
Yeah.
But most of the bigger hits, he's up front, standing and singing,
and crooning and singing. Cool.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen Paul, but I haven't seen Ringo live. Would be an interesting show to see. I definitely. I'm going to imagine it's a very good vibe, very good energy at a Ringo show.
Yeah, I'm going to see him on June 7th in Guilford, New Hampshire.
Oh, nice. That's a great.
Which was rescheduled from 2 years ago.
Is that the outdoor arena in New Hampshire?
I've never been there, but I believe it is an outdoor arena.
It's beautiful. It's very much I like. I know we're talking very local here, but it's one of the best outdoor arenas, like Great Woods or.
Oh, that's great.
Or it's that kind of vibe there. Mm-hmm. So I think that would be a really great audience to see Ringo. It's not quite. I'd say it's the second best to Red Rocks that I've been to, which was amazing. I actually have to look back to see if the Beatles ever played Red Rocks. That would have been an amazing place to see them.
All right, let's move on to the topics if we don't have any more Beatle news.
The only other minor news would be that I never realized that Paul McCartney in a band that he had in I think it was the 90s, maybe early 2000s, me being the giant, incredible Pink Floyd fan, I didn't realize that he had David Gilmour in his band. I was watching some YouTube videos they were playing some rock and roll standards. They played a couple of Beatles songs, and his lead guitar player was David Gilmour from Pink Floyd. And that was
at the Cavern. I think that was a live show at the Cavern.
That's exactly what I saw. It was incredible.
Yeah, it was really good. I don't remember the album that he was promoting at the time, but maybe it was Run Devil Run or.
But that, or maybe Flaming Pot was Flaming.
Or
Pirate?
Yeah,
Might be. But either way, it
What-
was an excellent performance that I suggest anyone that's both Pink Floyd and a Beatles fan check out and watch that, because it's just surreal seeing David Gilmour stand next to Paul McCartney. And of course, even being David Gilmour, who is a huge act that sells, he's standing in the background. He can't take center stage on that, and he's even laying back and playing guitar solos in the way you can tell that Paul has probably guided him towards, instead of playing David Gilmour. It's a very unique situation to see as a huge Floyd fan myself.
That's one thing that I've always enjoyed is, and there's a couple of examples. Billy Joel, when they closed down Shea Stadium, and I'm not sure where this was, but Bruce Springsteen singing "Twist and Shout" with Paul and Little Steve, and it's just amazing to see these great musicians and to see them, playing with a Beatle. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And similar thing happened. I don't think it worked as well. And this is the show you're thinking about, Dave. I just remembered what you were thinking about when Paul played with the surviving members of Nirvana. He played with that square guitar that I know. I can't think of the name of it, but even seeing something like that, which I didn't think sounded amazing necessarily, it was still cool to see Paul McCartney in that context playing with the guys from Nirvana for yet another generation. So yeah, any Beatles fans and Pink Floyd fans, I recommend looking up The Cavern, Paul McCartney from the 90s with David Gilmour.
All right. Who wants to go first with their topic of the week?
Okay, so my topic is about it's not a fictitious meeting, but it's a meeting that has a lot of hearsay and different stories about. So I'd love to get everyone's thoughts on this. I think it was 1965, I believe, the Beatles and Elvis Presley had a famous meeting. No one really knew about it at the time. It was built up, but for a long period of time, that through the Colonel, the Beatles actually met with the Colonel first to talk about it. And Colonel Parker, if people don't know, Beatles fans, was Elvis's very controlling manager. So a lot of what came out of this, I wonder how much was framed by Elvis's people. Everyone has sort of different stories about this. Some of the facts of it was that Elvis was playing bass. When they walked in, there was some sort of jamming going on. Some people claim all the Beatles were jamming minus Ringo. George says, I wasn't jamming. I was out looking for weed. And Ringo says he was playing football with the Memphis Mafia type guys. And John and Paul were jamming with Elvis. Playing Scylla's Black, You're My World was the song that they were playing along. And I guess they were jamming all night. They hung out. Apparently, again, some of this is hearsay, and I love to hear what all the stories you've heard about this. The Beatles did something that night to piss off Elvis, or someone got in Elvis's ear that night. Some people claim it was John talking too much, like Peace Nick, and using an Inspector Clouseau voice, that they were smoking too much green stuff over the night or drinking and kept offering Elvis, that they were in Elvis's face because he was shooting like Party Time in Hawaii at that point in time and being like, why aren't you doing rock and roll anymore? Which, funny enough, 3 years later, he did what I consider the greatest Elvis thing he ever did, the 1968 special. I don't know how you guys feel, and you guys can each share. I came to Elvis later than the Beatles. I came to the Beatles first, and Pulp Fiction has the joke, you got to be a Beatles or a Elvis fan. Okay, I'm a Beatles person, but I like them both. And my mother was way into Elvis, but she liked the movie Elvis, sexy Elvis, good looking. The music she could care less about. And I viewed Elvis in that light. But then accidentally watched some of the clips from the 1968 special, and I could feel the rock and roll influence of the Beatles on him in that 1968 special, even right down to the song that he does at the end. And I also want to add, I have some other bullet points. I also found from 1972 a recording on Elvis on YouTube that was recorded by Priscilla at a party where Elvis sings about 10 Beatles songs and a couple of John Lennon solo songs. I'll put it in the comment section of this particular video. But apparently, years later, there was a rumor. Some people think this is a rumor. Some people think it's fact that when Elvis met with Nixon, he tried to get them expelled from the United States. That they said that they were bad for the youth and all of that. But there is no corroborative evidence to back that up necessarily. If you think a couple of years later, he was joyfully singing Beatles songs. What I think is that Elvis was jealous of the Beatles, of their musical creative freedom, of the freedom that Brian Epstein gave them. And there was some sense of jealousy of the group that they had around them, of the four of them, and he was alone by himself. I don't think he hated them. I think he had nothing but love for the Beatles. How about you guys? What did you think about, what have you heard about that particular situation? And I guess, what are your opinions of Elvis?
I'd like to respond if I may.
Oh, go ahead.
One is
Sorry.
Go ahead, David. I'll wait.
Okay, so I've always felt that Elvis felt threatened by the Beatles, and you know, it was only him where, you know, jealousy, threatened, and you know, nobody knew. I mean, it's really sad the way the ending that Elvis had, and you know, it makes you wonder, all these people around him, you know, how many really knew the real person in there. You know, it's really sad. So I that's, you know, I don't have a lot to say about this topic, but yeah, I really think that, you know, they were just threatening to him. And the stuff in the 70s with Nixon, I mean, I don't know what he would be gaining, except maybe to you know, obviously he was, wasn't he a some sort of a, for the U.S. government,
There's rumors that he was connected with the CIA a little bit or something. There was rumors of
but
that.
I thought he had something to do with drugs or anti-drugs, and I just wonder if, you know, putting some light on the Beatles maybe just took the spotlight off of him a little bit and what he was doing in his own personal life. That would be my opinion.
I agree with everything I've heard this far. I want to add a couple of things. One, just make a comment. I thought that was one of the funniest scenes in the anthology when they were trying to describe what Priscilla was wearing, and they all had a different outfit for her. And then George said he doesn't remember her being there because he was trying to suss out from the henchmen if they had a reefer. I thought that was hysterical. Not only did the Beatles match or even eclipse Elvis's popularity music-wise, but Elvis Presley's films, although everybody went to see them, were critically panned. And the Beatles' Hard Day's Night was critically acclaimed. And I might have led to even more jealousy on Elvis's part. I do believe Elvis was jealous of the Beatles, as probably a lot of other entertainers were at that time period, where Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys might have been the one that actually marveled and loved the Beatles and admitted it way back even before one of his meltdowns. But I think Elvis was. Paul even referenced at some point that he was very hurt by Elvis's comments regarding the Beatles' deportation from America. And he said that he felt ashamed that Elvis would feel so threatened by them. So with that comment, I'm thinking McCartney might know a little bit more than I would on the subject. So I would tend to think there's a little bit of truth there regarding that. Of course, it was never going to happen, but I could see because of the music and the movie itself that there was a bit of jealousy there. Plus, Elvis wasn't making. I mean, the Beatles were right. Elvis, I love listening to the '50s stuff, the rockabilly, the rock and roll, but the stuff in the movies I can't listen to. To me, it's not Elvis. It's
except for the song "A Little Less Conversation." I don't have anything for most of his movie songs. I just happen to like that particular song, and I think there's a song called "Dirty" or something like that, or "Trouble." If you're looking for trouble, you can come to the right place. But other than those two, which are in his early couple of movies, when he actually there's a really good Elvis documentary on HBO. I recommend everyone watching it if you have any passive interest in Elvis. It explains a lot, and I think George was very much aware of that too in the anthology. He mentions, it's Ringo that says it, how sad it was that Elvis had a bunch of sycophants around him that would say what he needed to say, that Elvis wanted to record music. He wanted to pay money to get more songs. And I mean, that's the other thing. Elvis wasn't a songwriter, and he needed other people to write songs, and Colonel wouldn't pony up the money to the top songwriters of the time. So, and when he finally did, he'd get a hit, and then he wouldn't do it again. When Elvis did 1968, they just tried to do that special over and over again, and then put him on tour and then make money off the tours instead of letting him make it more special. So I don't know. I feel bad for Elvis and all of that, but I do think he was jealous of the Beatles. Len, what are your thoughts on all of this?
I agree with that. I think, what you just said about him not being a composer, the Beatles were everything that Elvis wasn't, and Elvis knew it. And Elvis was in the right place at the right time. I'm going to say something very unpopular. He was just lucky he had a great voice and he had the great look.
Good luck, him.
He wasn't an artist like the Beatles were. And he was looked up to, and they were inspired by him, but not by his creativity, in my opinion. It was just, like I said, at that time, they were young guys. He got all the girls. They wanted to be like him in a bunch of ways. But, you know, it was kind of like, you know, I'm trying to think of another analogy that, you know, a greater person is looking up to a lesser person. I shouldn't say it that way. That's a horrible way of saying it. It makes Elvis look bad, but I'm not very much an Elvis fan. I like some of his stuff sometimes, but I think his legendary status really has more to do with the timing of his early Sun sessions than it does with anything else.
I agree. Give it to Chuck Berry. You know what I mean? Like Chuck Berry was writing the songs. Buddy Holly, even before that, writing song. To me, maybe it's the age that I live in. Songwriting is so important to me. But to your point, when you said the Elvis isn't as big of an artist as the Beatles, this might be a controversial statement, or in that sense of like a writing artist. I would say he's not even as big of an artist, or not big of an artist, a creative artist as someone like Frank Sinatra or Dean Martin or Sammy, like that generation of performers. Elvis is less unique he's more reiterating the stuff that he's heard, and he's doing it in a very genuine way. I think Elvis's greatest talent is when he sings, you believe it. Yes, it's his look. And to your point too, Len, I feel like the Beatles were always obsessively focused on how Elvis looks. You know, like, oh, he looked good. He looked really good there. He was the sexy Elvis. Because part of that thing is, like you said, I think more than anything, people wanted to like get girls like Elvis did.
If you look at John on the cover of the rock and roll album, John Lennon Rock and Roll, he's going for the Elvis look right there. You know, Paul McCartney has a great Elvis imitation on Wings' London Town album, and you know that's never going to change. That would never have changed because he's the guy they look up to. It's like a teacher and students. You know, the students are never going to see eye to eye. They're never going to be peers. You know what I mean? It's just because of the way who came first.
Yeah, I'm trying to call you Len, but I still want to call you Mr. Kaplan.
You never called me Mr. Kaplan.
No, I didn't. I called you a different name that you really hated, actually. Everyone
I don't remember that.
I don't. It ends with a Y.
Oh, yes, I don't like that name.
Yeah, you know, I'm not even going to say it because I don't want to. I don't remember you calling
me that.
I think most kids called you that. I don't want to. We're at the end.
Behind my back.
No. We said we love Len E.
Whatever. Anyway, I dissed Elvis, but I'm going to make up for it right now by saying that, having said what I just said, Elvis was denied a lot of opportunities because of his relationship with Colonel Parker. And Elvis was like kind of a cautionary tale, which I wish the Beatles had heeded when Alan Klein came along. Somebody should have pointed out, you want to be like Elvis in that way? Go with Alan Klein. Parker caught Elvis with Natalie Wood rehearsing some very serious play, and he broke it up, you know, because he didn't want him to get ideas to do any of those more serious movies beyond those silly love movies. Silly love movies.
Just a bunch of silly love songs. And that's the true. And I guess the final word on this is Colonel Parker never wanted anyone to get into Elvis's ear. So even if Elvis didn't have a problem with the Beatles, when the Beatles were in there in the room saying to Parker himself, why aren't you letting him record rock and roll music? And then saying it to Elvis, why aren't you letting him? He could very easily have gotten to Elvis's ear. These guys are trouble. You need to get these guys out. You need to talk to people. So I definitely think he had a part of that.
So my verdict on Elvis and the Beatles is Elvis really wasn't, in my eyes, my Beatle eyes, worthy of the adulation that the Beatles imposed upon him. A very telling moment was when they were making the album Sgt. Pepper, and they were doing the artwork with all their favorite heroes. They realized when they were done that they forgot to put Elvis on. That's kind of weird. That's kind of interesting.
That is very interesting. I didn't even think about that. And You were trying to think of the perfect analogy for it. I'm trying to as well. I think the best thing is when you're into something when you're younger, or you enjoy something when you're younger, and then you get older and you've sort of grown out of that interest, or you look at it with different eyes. Uh, there's an episode of Frasier where when they were young, they saw an actor perform Shakespeare, and they thought that Shakespeare was beautiful and wonderful. They saw him later in life, and he was on a cheesy television show, and they're like, "We're going to produce a perfect play. We're gonna bring this guy back." And then they heard him do it again. They're like, "Oh, why are we into this guy then?" And I do think there was an element of that with the Beatles when Elvis was in his movie making phase. And I think a lot of the reason why they didn't hang out again, because they did invite him to hang out to a party afterwards, after that one hangout. The Memphis Mafia guys showed up and hung out for a while, but there was never another meeting. None of the recording of them playing together was, and I see what you're saying, Len, because I think there's a lot of people that, I mentioned them earlier. Chuck Berry, I'll say his name again, as one of the pioneers of songwriting and rock and roll, that doesn't give the credit he deserves all the time. That they wanted to influence Elvis to do more what they wanted him to do, so I think there was a lot of, as we've said, jealousy mixed in there as well.
Jealousy, rivalry, one-upsmanship, whatever you want to call it. It just didn't work. I mean, you can't enforce, just because they were both great in their era at the top of their game in different eras, doesn't mean that they're supposed to be buddy. You know what I mean? You don't know who you're going to be best friends with when you meet somebody.
No.
You know?
And the only way that they're analogous is when you're discussing the top selling artists of all time, and there's three names and no one else counts. There's the Beatles, Michael Jackson, and Elvis. You talk about those three, and I mean, Michael Jackson's a different story. It wasn't on our topic list, but I'm sure he'll come up at some point in time in all of our discussions, in his relationship with Paul McCartney and how that deteriorated. But to your point, Len, the people that you respect, the other greatest artists of the world, don't always have to get along, and there's other sides to them. Michael Jackson was a slick businessman too, that saw an opportunity and took it. And Elvis was a person that was prone to insecurity, and he had people around him that enhanced that and destroyed his life because of it. And both perfect examples to be antagonists in some story against the Beatles.
I think Elvis was the most famous and wealthy victim of mismanagement of all time.
Perfectly said.
Yep.
All right. Next topic.
I think I'm going to volunteer to use my topic because it coincides with what we've talked about a couple times tonight. The name Alan Klein keeps popping up, but my question is, what impact did the death of Brian Epstein have on the Beatles? So I'm going to put that out there to the group, and I'll give my comments after.
I'm going to start off here by commending you, Seth, because you're the only one that I know that says Epstein. I even say Epstein. It is, in his case, it's Epstein, and that's correct. His impact is incalculable, because before Brian Epstein, the Beatles had really nothing. They had no rudder, no guidance. They had Alan Williams was manager in name only. He didn't do all the stuff that Brian Epstein did. He didn't know anything about PR, as far as I know. I read Alan Williams' book. He booked them in Germany. I guess that's his most significant contribution to the Beatles' career. But it wasn't until Brian Epstein that they were convinced that they had to have a record in the charts to go any further than where they had gone in England, and to conquer the world after that. They depended on him. I think he held them together. They wanted to please him because he had done so much for them, especially in the beginning. And he got them to clean up their act literally by getting them to dress up on stage. And that's a little bit, may seem old fashioned now, but it was still that era. the Beatles are like the era that kind of loosened everybody up after the Beatles. But going into it, the Beatles themselves had to conform to the standards of show business in 1962, 1963. And that meant the bowing and the tie and all that. And it seems a little corny now to see that, especially how history of entertainment has gone since then. Anything goes now. But over the years, when the Beatles stopped touring and they became a studio band, they stopped needing Brian Epstein as much, overtly at least, and they sort of took him for granted. And many say, and I'm not sure if this isn't true, I don't know if he killed himself on purpose or whether it was a drug overdose, but it's kind of funny that he felt less needed at the time of his death than he did in 1964 or 1965. So his loss is just tragic for them, because that's what made Paul McCartney have to fill the void, and that didn't sit well, especially with George. And that was the beginning of the end for them. And that's my take on it.
It's a shame that he felt marginalized at that point in time, because I think at that point he was more important than ever to them, and he didn't realize it. I agree. I would just be echoing almost everything Len said, but what I do want to add to that is, when you were talking about the dressing up and all of that, what's something that's so important even today in modern entertainment, we talk about who started certain things. Brian Epstein started branding. He took a ragtag group of whatever's, the guys that were in Hamburg playing and just, dressing up in leather coats and all different vibes. And he came up with a branding concept of how to sell and package the Beatles, while also doing something that not a lot of managers do. We spent some time this evening talking about Colonel Parker a little bit, and he's like the anti-Parker in some ways. He connected with George Martin, trusted George Martin on the musical end. George Martin tells a funny story about the one time he suggested something musically. He was drunk with some friends and came in the studio and was like, "Oh, John, you should do this and not this." And John's like, "Shut up. You handle the money. We handle the music." But they had that kind of, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, they had the kind of dynamic with him. He knew also something that a lot of managers don't understand, giving them the space they needed to be creative artists and evolve. He had that idea of the branding locked in, but he also saw how they evolved and was able to sort of, let them be them while still being that hand. And that's why I think it's unfortunate, whatever did happen to him. The unfortunate part about it is what I said at the beginning. Len, you're absolutely right. At that stage, whether he turned to more drug use because he had more time on his hands, or he was feeling marginalized and out of the loop, but he was more needed than ever because of all the reasons you mentioned. Paul taking over, which eventually led to George resentment, eventually leading to Alan Klein and all of that, and which led to Apple or Alan Klein and the split and everything, which ultimately is the reason the Beatles broke up. And at least that, from my perspective, it's all about business. It was all money, splintered. It didn't have anything to do with creative. They may have turned into releasing George albums once in a while, releasing Paul albums once in a while, but it would have always been an entity, and you would have always had them come back. I know it's a modern day representation, but I've mentioned it before. Wu-Tang does that too. They have a Wu-Tang Clan album, and then they produce individual members of the band's album, and then they come back together to do a uniform. I think the Beatles would have started that if it wasn't for the Alan Klein situation, and which happened because of Brian Epstein's unfortunate passing. So the first thing that you said is absolutely 100% true. It's incalculable, the effect that it had on the Beatles, and I think directly led to them not working together as a whole unit. And before unfortunately what happened to John happened to John. So great, amazing what he did for the Beatles.
The only thing I can add to that is, given the circumstances and where they were in their career, I seem to agree with you, Phil, that it wouldn't have come to what it came to, them breaking up. I think the brand would have, you know, it would have been about the brand, right? Always. And, you know, it's sad that it, you know, they kind of lost their way after that to a point. I mean, certainly did some of their best work, I mean, afterwards, right? But yeah, it's too bad that, you know, they lost that stable force to keep them always moving forward.
Musically, they definitely kept evolving and kept growing as artists, but you could argue that post his death, they didn't really do anything together. Like, you know, it's hard to get them all together to do one great project, and maybe influenced by the 68 special of Elvis, like them trying to do that big TV special thing to be the Beatles back playing live again, you know, that was disorganized. And you got to believe if Brian Epstein was a part of that, that wouldn't have been disorganized either. He would have been able to produce a live television concert with the Beatles live that would have happened somewhere after Sgt. Pepper Magical Mystery Tour time period. He would have produced this like big, huge live concert. I don't know. I know I'm playing the Miss Cleo what if thing, but I do believe in some ways that those things would have happened.
I'm going to mention something. This might not be popular. I often wonder, more lately, because of a comment that George made in the Get Back film. We said it's never been the same once Mr. Epstein died. But I wonder, Alan Klein always wanted the Beatles more than the Rolling Stones. He would have met John. He met John, I believe it was at the Rock and Roll Circus event. I still have a feeling that John would have broken from Brian Epstein and gone with Alan Klein because Alan Klein impressed him. And I think the rift still would have happened, even if Brian had lived. I don't know if much would have been different. I think the Beatles, when they found out that 90% of their merchandise rights were given away, and they didn't make any money on the Beatle wigs and the Beatle games, and that came out, I think, in a Lennon Remembered, what's a paperback, Lennon Remembered, or a pod cover. It's a Rolling Stone interviews from 1970, 70. It was right after the Beatles split. A lot of nasty comments were written there. There was a lot of anger there. And some of the comments were directed at Brian. I think they outgrew mentally Brian by the point of 67. So I don't know. I wonder. It's a great discussion because it's that great what if. But I think Alan Klein had his sights set on the Beatles and would have got them one way or the other. And I still think Paul would have probably stuck with Brian instead of trying to get his father-in-law to manage him. And that might have been a little bit different. But I think the inevitable that they were going to split was going to happen.
Yeah, it's I guess it's that time travel paradox thing. What's going to happen is going to happen no matter what. It just would have happened in a different way. That's why I kept thinking when you said it would have eventually gotten to that point, because as we were talking earlier, it all completes. John was very influenceable and he could be influenced very easily. And when he saw something he wanted, you couldn't really talk him out of that. So if he was enamored by Alan Klein, that would have been something that stuck with him through forever. And he would have always theoretically met Yoko and wanted to be his own brand in some sense too. So it is interesting. That's the interesting what if. What would have happened if Brian didn't pass?
Now, if Alan Klein did his homework and this scenario did happen, Seth, and he went after the Beatles and Brian never died, the way to do it would have been through John and saying, well, I'm going to have a different producer, somebody that you want, because we all know that John wasn't a George Martin guy. As much as George Martin made John's stuff sound great, for some reason, John wasn't satisfied. And he told George Martin that at a meeting that they had in a restaurant, I think, or something. He said, I would have changed every arrangement, everything that I've ever done. And George Martin said, even Strawberry Fields? He said, especially Strawberry
Put
Fields.
his glasses down, yes.
Len, that's one of the things that like gets me sometimes, because I know John hates the second side of Abbey Road. And that's like my favorite. That's one of my favorite parts of the Beatles, like that whole orchestration and all of that. But some part of me wonders if John's always going to be the guy that's going to want the other girl. You know, in a sense that like he just needed something else in his mind. Like he got stuck in his mind, because I agree with you. I don't think his voice ever sounded as good as when George Martin produced his voice. Like he knew how to. And I know other people were working the knobs, but he just knew how to produce Lennon's sound in a way. But maybe it's not what Lennon wanted. He wanted something more raw, and something more like what he eventually did with Yoko, with like a looseness to it of some sort. But I don't know.
If you compare the side two of Abbey Road, which Paul kind of tried to replicate on Red Rose Speedway, one song melting into another, you can sort of see John's point. If those songs were lesser, like the ones on Red Rose Speedway, then John would have been correct.
Yeah, but they weren't. They were some of the best songs that ever put together ever. And yeah, oh boy,
There was no way to tell that because I've been listening to a lot of early, as we all have, the Get Back sessions, and there were a lot of little Polythene Pam here and all the other little songs, and they all sound crappy by themselves. How could we have imagined, because we weren't them, that they would all be produced so fantastically and blend together the way they had? I mean, that has to do with George Martin too.
I was just going to ask you guys that question. Do you credit that second side to Paul or George? And by George, I mean George Martin, like, or the combination of what makes that so perfection. It's the two of their minds and creative energies working in this perfect parallel. Because I think Paul definitely has a lot to do with that second half, and even the orchestration of the Lennon songs where they take place. Or at least I wonder how much Paul had to do with that. Because Paul was.
Has anybody taken credit for the idea?
Did he?
Well, that's what I'm asked. That's what I'm wondering. I'm not sure if anybody took credit for the actual idea. Or
you mean the songs blending into side two of Abbey Road, you mean?
Yeah.
It's definitely a Paul thing, because I've heard many references to it by Paul and John and other people.
Yeah, I think John blamed Paul for it. Yeah, so it was.
They all agreed on one thing on Abbey Road, and that Something was the best song on it. That's what they all agreed on. And that's something for John and Paul to agree on, because it was George's song.
Something attracts me like a pomegranate was the best lyric. And to Get Back, he couldn't come up with that line. And when he did come up with the line that worked, it was a great line. And I think that was one of my favorite scenes from that film. When Paul was writing Get Back, he came up with the song in a minute and a half from nothing. And that was amazing to see as well.
Playing on the bass by himself.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was unbelievable.
Ringo and George trying to stay awake.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Next topic, I guess. We exhausted that one, I guess. Who's up?
Incident, real quick. I met Alan Williams in 1981.
Really?
At a Beatles convention. It might have actually been 80. I went to a Beatles convention, my first one in downtown Boston. I think it was near the Combat Zone, if I'm not mistaken, which still existed in those days. It was about 2 weeks after Lennon's, maybe a week after the murder of Lennon. It was very close to it. They had a news camera there too, talking to some of the fans. It might have been the following year I went. It might have been 81 or 82. Alan Williams was he had a table there. He was selling Alan Williams autographs. And he was with a young lady, I remember. So yeah, that was, I forgot about that until now. I think I have the autograph somewhere in the house.
Did you talk to him?
Briefly. I couldn't tell you what we spoke about, but I remember getting the autograph on. It was like a flyer, and he had it signed Alan Williams. They're all pre-signed, and so I grabbed one of those. I might have had to pay for it, but I don't recall paying for it. I might have taken it on purpose by accident. So, but I forgot about that. And it was my first or second Beatles convention I went to. And probably the last. I don't recall going to another one afterwards.
All right, who has a topic?
I guess I can go with mine. It's more of a story. And the more I think about it, it was June 11th, 2001. I went down to New York City for a book signing, but let me rewind a couple of days. I'm at home on a Thursday, cleaning the house by myself, listening to WZLX. And, when there was no Twitter then, there was, 2001, I think the internet was around. I think I had a computer, but it was pretty early. But so I heard a Beatles song on the radio, and it might have been Chuck Nolan or one of them, but he says Paul McCartney's coming to New York City to do a book signing on Monday. I said, wow, I'm on vacation. Let me, so I said, you know what? Back then I wasn't married, no kids, I said, I'm going to go down to New York. So I called Barnes and Noble and I said, I'm hearing about this book signing. And they're like, well, it's open to the public and, you just have to buy a copy of the book. And, I'm hearing there might already be some people in line. So maybe I called on Friday, but anyway, long story short, $84 Greyhound bus. I left Sunday afternoon, got there at 5 p.m. on Sunday night, walked to Barnes and Noble, and I walked up to the table and they said, you're number 93. I said, okay, 93, that's, I'll take it. I'll go with it. So like I said, that was about 5 p.m. on Sunday. He was due to arrive 12:30 on Monday afternoon. And so, it was nice to, it was a long night, meet people from, all around the country. The, sad thing was this was 3 months to the day before 9/11, it was June 11th, 2001. So when I look back on that now, it was one of those things that, 9 a.m. in the morning, people were walking by, they see these people waiting in line. Nobody knew about it. People were walking by saying, why are you guys here? What are you waiting for? So it was almost like Beatlemania to a point where it was like, Paul McCartney's coming. Where is he? And the crowds are building up on the street. And here I am, I'm holding my, I'm number 93. And I had my Polaroid camera in my bag. And, my plan was, I'm going to meet Paul McCartney. I'm getting a picture. And, so now I'm waiting in line, you're walking in the door. And then previous to that, he pulls up in the car and, I saw his press agent, Jeff Baker, I think his name was, that he was a chain smoker. So he walked by and I'm like, oh my God, Paul McCartney's going to be, it was a great experience, but walk into the room and, there he is. And I'm like, I'm not going to take a picture. I'm not going to come all this way and, get thrown out for taking a picture. So this is my pride and joy, my autograph. Well, I have the book To Dave, Paul McCartney, 2001. And my meeting with him, it's amazing. You would think that I would remember every second of that. And I don't, to be honest. I shook his hand and I remember, just seeing his hands. He had really huge hands, and just at that moment thinking about, what those hands had done, and he was very, hey, where are you from? Yeah, I'm from Boston. Oh, did you have a hard time getting off from work? And it's like he's just trying to get to know you, and I'm just like, you're Paul effing McCartney, but shook my hand, and we had a little bit of small talk. It was probably 2 minutes, autographed the book, and then moved on. So he ended up signing 120 books that day, and and it was pretty amazing. A lot of people waited in line and just didn't make it. He was there about an hour and a half, and once I got my book, went outside and waited in the crowd for him, to come out, and he does his waving thing, and I snapped a bunch of pictures, and the only picture I got one picture of his hand with his wedding ring. But it was a pretty special event that I'll never forget.
Wow. That
Yeah,
sounds,
thank you for telling us. That's wonderful.
that is amazing. The first thing that makes me think is at least they didn't stop at, like, what were you, 93, did you say? Like,
Yeah,
Yeah.
90.
he stopped at 92. He's like, oh, see you later. But that was perfect timing. You got a perfect number. And I feel like in that moment, if I would, not with someone of the stature of Paul McCartney, but it was a similar situation with Weird Al after one of his concerts, like waiting in a line just to meet him, and he's just stopping, saying hi to everyone, like making conversation. But I turn into Chris Farley. I turn into the Chris Farley sketch from Saturday Night Live. Oh my gosh, it's Paul McCartney. Remember when you recorded that song? It was so good, you know?
Yeah.
Like, I'm just gonna be that guy in that moment. So it doesn't surprise me that you don't necessarily remember it, because everything slows down. Even
Right.
if for me anyways, even if I don't necessarily, the handful of celebrities that I've actually met are small, but the biggest one was meeting Andre the Giant in an air. And I remember in an airport and being a kid and being like him and Haku. Landon was
Wow.
I met in the Orlando airport when I was like 7 or something. And Andre's hand wrapped around mine like 3 or 4 times. That's all, it's flashing memory. Or like the Weird Al thing, I just remember I don't even like Jay Leno, and I met him once and I was like a little bit like, whoa, the chin's really that big in reality. But I froze for a second and just didn't know what to say, and can't tell you a lot about the meeting other than he called me Doug Henning. And he's like, hey, Doug Henning, what's going on? I'm like, Doug Henning? Oh, who's? And I knew who he was. And I said, people call me, say I look like Jesus. He's like, that's good for you, kid. Working for you, kid. And just walked off.
That's a good imitation.
And
but this was the point. This was the point where, mid 2001, he hadn't toured in 8 years, and he did the concert for New York. And that was the first time he played with his current band that he's been playing with for 21 years. And, and then, since then he's been touring pretty much every 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it is. And he's still at it.
From one of his lyrics, people pass me by on my imaginary street, ordinary people it's impossible to meet. That kind of situation that you're describing was on his mind, because he made a concerted effort to meet regular people, which is awesome.
Yeah. And
did you all see the film Imagine, where Lennon was walking and a kid was playing basketball?
Yeah, that's a
It's
great.
great. Isn't that
John Lennon? When you get back together, he's like tomorrow.
Yeah, tomorrow. That in the whole part where the guy's staying on his lawn and boy, when you wrote "Boy, you're gonna carry that weight." Well, that was Paul, and the guy's face just goes. And then he goes, "You want to come inside and have breakfast?" And then he invites the dude in for breakfast and hangs out with him, rips him apart, and then has him for breakfast. It's so beautiful.
My topic is the McGear album, the album that was produced by Paul McCartney for his brother Mike McCartney, who changed his name to McGear to distance himself from the madness that was Beatlemania. And he had been part of a group called The Scaffold, and this was his solo effort, and Paul produced it. And I think this album is very significant because it's such a great album. I think it's better than any Wings album. You get to hear the McCartney brothers singing together in harmony and unison and writing together. All of those songs were, with the exception of one by Brian Ferry, was written by both brothers. And let's see, is there anyone? I got the song list right here. Sea Breezes was written by Brian Ferry. Great songs like Leave It was on there. That sounds like the Beatles right there. He came closest in this album to producing the kind of an album that he would have done with the Beatles for some reason. But the mystery to me is, why did Paul not do other things with his brother? Why only this one album? If you look back in some of the biographies, in one of them, Mike McCartney was going to be the drummer for the Beatles in an early incarnation. It might have been for the Quarrymen or Silver Beatles at the time, but he broke his arm. But these little quirks of fate. It might have worked out with the McCartney brothers, and then there would have been a change in the power balance between Lennon and McCartney because of that. It's just I'm fascinated with Mike McCartney, because of the quality of this album. You don't hear much about him except in one of the biographies, and I can't remember which one it is. The quality of the songs, and even the way the record was produced. I'm always complaining about the early McCartney albums being, the drum sounds are blunted and everything sounds cheap. this almost sounded like not quite a George Martin production, but it was elevated. It was just incredible, and it's a mystery that, if I ever got the chance to interview Paul McCartney, I would ask him, why didn't you work with your brother more? Or are you going to work with your brother again? Just a fantastic album. So I want to know what you guys think of it if you've ever heard it.
You know when it was recorded?
74.
Or I was going to say early 70s.
Right after Band on the Run. So that, that was his best
Okay.
McCartney album or Wings album. And he went right into this. And Linda was on it and Denny Lane was on it.
I remember Linda being on it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just phenomenal album. I still listen to it.
I listened to it for the first time probably about 2 months ago. And I don't think I listened to the entire, I just kind of went through it. And so I didn't really know much about it, but I guess the first thing that would come to my mind is, I mean, is it possible, not to take anything away from Mike McCartney, but is it possible that this was Paul McCartney making an album and his brother's kind of along for the ride? Or, you know what I'm saying? I mean,
I was going to piggyback on that a little bit just to say that having been not on the level of those kind of situations, but having been in a band with two brothers, one of my longest forming band, the guitar player and the bass player were twin brothers, actually. Great, worked well together musically, everything they play together, but there's only so much you can work with your brother sometimes in a high creative environment, let alone add that you got Paul, who is like the biggest, one of the biggest stars in the world. I'm making up my own head canon in here with what possibly happened, but perhaps it wasn't the smoothest process working together. And Paul's someone that seems like post some of the tension in the Beatles wants as good vibes as possible. And brothers or family members can kind of go at each other in a way that other professional musicians won't necessarily attack each other. So I'm making this all up. I have no foundation for that other than to say I've been in bands with brothers before and they fight a lot. And there's a history of this. The Van Halen brothers, the band Nelson from the 80s. Like when brothers play together, the Black Crowes has a history of that with the Black Crowes as well. Brothers in bands, the Oasis, all those bands that have brothers in it seem to historically have some issues.
You get the Kinks and Spencer Davis you could add to the list as well. And I agree with you on that. But I listened to the Mike McCartney album once, many, many years ago. And I have it somewhere here. I'll have to put it back on the turntable. I'll have to find it first, to be honest with you. But it's been a long time. I don't think I could really give a good reflection of it right now.
Well, I think getting back to what Dave said, I think that definitely Paul McCartney didn't do this for Mike McCartney. I mean, there's definitely the feel of a collaboration there and a give and take, and maybe it was too much, like Phil was saying, because why wouldn't Paul do that for himself? You know what I mean? Or maybe he couldn't tell the difference. What was better? I don't know. I it's just a matter of taste, really. I just happen to think that this is the best thing that he did in his 70s period.
Was Mike McCartney musical? Did he play any instruments? Did he?
Oh yeah. I don't know what instruments he played, but I mean, his band was more like a comedy band. The Scaffold was like a comedy musical group. And he did a lot of commercials, and of course, he wasn't as famous as his brother, right, but he definitely got the creative gene, I think.
He was in the Let It Be movie too. Oh no, the Get Back. I'm calling it Let It Be. Get Back movie.
Same footage. Well, that's all for today's show. Join us next time with more topics. And until then,
I'm Seth.
I'm Dave.
I'm Len.
I'm Phil.
And we are
the
Beatlemaniacs. Questions for the Beatlemaniacs? Write to TheBeatlemaniacspodcast@gmail.com, and maybe your question will get on the show.